Of all the foolish choices the Reldorian Empire could have made, trying to scare humans was somewhere between poking a sleeping bear and juggling grenades at a funeral. The first official meeting was set in the neutral orbit of Delta 9, a cold, metal platform wrapped in an artificial atmosphere bubble. The Reldorians arrived first, clearly showing off their battleship. The Conqueror of Stars broke through the hyperspace rift with a roar that could be heard even through the thin air of the station's inner deck, thanks to vibration amplifiers. They had installed, every part of their ship was designed to cause fear. Black plating that absorbed light, sharp fins that looked like predator features, and massive weapon ports that seemed to stare down at the human delegation like hungry wolves eyeing their next meal. Captain Ellis stood at the front of the human group, arms casually crossed, chewing a piece of synthetic gum as if waiting for a bus. Behind him stood Major Finley and Lieutenant Zhang, both in perfectly clean dress uniforms that seemed to glow under the harsh station lights. Not one of them flinched as the Reldorian generals stepped off their ship, wrapped in cloaks made from the fibers of extinct creatures and decorated with medals the size of dinner plates. The lead Reldorian, General Nuzak, marched forward with the posture of someone who thought he was walking into a defeated enemy's throne room. He was broad-shouldered and scaly with a strong jawline. His voice came through a translator attached to his neck, producing a deep, grinding sound. "Humans," he said with obvious disdain, "we present the Conqueror of Stars, the mightiest ship ever built. Behold your superior." He gestured dramatically toward the window where the massive vessel loomed, its size blocking out many of the stars visible from the deck. It was an impressive piece of engineering, no denying that. But Ellis didn't even blink. Instead, he tilted, his head slightly as if trying to remember where he had left his keys. General Nuzak, clearly expecting gasps of fear, or at least respectful whispers, frowned. "You are silent," he said. Ellis finally popped the gum from his mouth with a snap and replied, "Yeah, that's cute." Confusion spread through the Reldorian ranks. Nuzak's second-in-command, a thin officer named Commander Prax, leaned in and whispered, "Urgently." Ellis caught a few translated words about cultural misunderstanding and ritual respect displays, but he ignored them. He had bigger plans. With a casual wave of his hand, Ellis said, "You boys brought a knife to a gunfight. Let me show you what a real fleet looks like." He tapped his wrist console. Out past the station, hyperspace portals opened like silent fireworks. First came the Triumph's Echo, a carrier so vast it carried its own gravity generators just to avoid affecting nearby moons. Then the Ironclad, a dreadnought-class gunship with armor plating thicker than most planets' crust. Then the Liberty, Wild Thunder, Dawn Star, and Swift Justice. One after another they emerged, an endless parade of human engineering, at its most fierce and beautiful. But it wasn't just the size or number. It was the design philosophy that shocked the Reldorian commanders. Each ship was built for brutal, efficient warfare. No decoration, no showing off, just pure purpose. Weapon batteries lined every available surface. Shield generators pulsed with enough power to light entire continents. Engines rumbled with the sound of a barely contained storm, and still they came. 30 ships in total. Battle cruisers, corvettes, armored personnel carriers converted into mobile artillery platforms. Some were old enough to bear the scars of wars fought before the Reldorians even had space travel. Others gleamed with fresh metals specifically, designed to counter every known alien defense system. General Nuzak's mouth opened slightly. It was a tiny movement, but on the deck where every human officer was watching him carefully, it was as loud as a surrender flag. Ellis leaned in a little, lowering his voice just enough to force Nuzak to focus. "We build ships to end wars," he said, "not to show off at parties." Silence fell over the station. The Reldorian delegation shifted uncomfortably, looking from human to human as if trying to find some sign that this was all a joke. But Ellis stood completely still, his casual posture now feeling less like laziness and more like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Behind him, Major Finley allowed himself a small smile, the kind that said without words, "We didn't come here to be impressed. We came here to decide whether you were worth the ammunition." The Reldorian generals gathered near the viewport, muttering to one another in low, rattling tones. From where Ellis stood, their body language was easy to read: panic, confusion, wounded pride. Commander Prax gestured wildly toward the human fleet, his voice rising until it was barely below a shout before Nuzak silenced him with a heavy swipe of his hand. The general straightened, visibly pulling himself together before facing Ellis again. "You bring many ships," Nuzak said, his voice tighter now, "but quantity is not quality. The Conqueror alone could crush your fleet." Ellis clicked his tongue thoughtfully, like a man trying to decide between two nearly identical cans of soup. Then he glanced sideways at Lieutenant Zhang, who was already entering commands into his console. Within moments, a tactical display appeared on the viewing panel between the two groups. The Reldorian officers stiffened. The display showed a complete cross-section of the Conqueror, its weak points, reactor locations, blind spots, and estimated time to critical failure once engaged. 47 seconds. Ellis didn't say anything. He just let the numbers hang there like a hammer over glass. "We don't do quantity," Major Finley said, stepping forward for the first time. His voice was dry and clinical, like someone reading an autopsy report. "We do redundancy. Every one of our ships is built to function at 80% combat effectiveness, even if you punch a hole straight through the middle." Nuzak's hand twitched slightly at his side. He tried to recover by puffing up his chest and stepping toward the human delegation, but the moment had shifted against him, and everyone on the deck knew it. "You think you've seen battle?" Ellis asked, keeping his voice low, almost conversational. "You fought a few neighbor empires, shook a few planets, called yourselves conquerors. Cute. But have you ever fought something that wanted to lose, just so it could take you down with it?" General Nuzak stared at him, unblinking. "We have," Ellis continued. "They didn't build pretty ships. They didn't build shrines to their own egos. They built weapons that screamed death before they even fired, and we learned from them." Behind the Reldorians, the human fleet loomed larger, rotating slightly to show off the dense, brutal geometry of their designs. No curves, no elegant sweep of hulls like the Reldorians preferred, just angles, armor, and an unrelenting logic of destruction. Zhang toggled the display again. Now the screen showed a theoretical battle scenario: Conqueror versus even the smallest human cruiser, the Fury's Edge. Within 30 simulated seconds, the Conqueror was a drifting wreck, venting atmosphere and burning from 5 different decks. Prax growled something under his breath. The translator, slower than usual, struggled to keep up. "Your projections are lies. Propaganda." Ellis smiled mildly. "Test it." The offer hung in the air like static before lightning. For a long moment, it seemed like Nuzak might accept the challenge. His claws flexed against the metal floor, his teeth bared in what might have been a grimace or a grin. Either way, it didn't matter. Ellis knew he wouldn't, not because Nuzak lacked courage. By all accounts, the Reldorians were fierce in battle, but because courage alone wasn't enough. It took wisdom to know when you were outmatched. Wisdom and the deep survival instinct that whispers when death is close enough to taste. Nuzak exhaled slowly through flared nostrils. "You come to mock us," he said. "No," Ellis replied, completely serious now. "We come to prevent you from making the worst mistake in your empire's history." Major Finley added, "Pick the wrong fight. With us. And your name won't be remembered as conquerors. It'll be remembered as a cautionary tale." A heavy silence fell across the deck. Even the Reldorian foot soldiers, armed and armored, shifted uncomfortably. Zhang, seeing an opportunity, decided to twist the knife. "You know what the real joke is?" he said, flashing a lazy grin. "That's not even our full fleet. That's just the local defense group. If we called in the 1st and 3rd Strike Armadas, you'd have more ships on your doorstep than you have citizens. That was technically an exaggeration, but it was close enough to the truth that none of the Reldorians laughed. General Nuzak's expression darkened. His throat made a low, grinding noise, some ancient instinct rumbling to life. But he said nothing. Ellis watched the struggle play out. Pride versus survival. Ambition versus cold, hard reality. "You have until tomorrow's cycle to reconsider your position," Ellis said finally, his tone clipped and professional. "Then we talk again. If you want peace, we'll welcome it. If you want war—" He let the sentence hang unfinished. There was no need to say more. Turning on his heel, Ellis led his officers back toward their docking bay, leaving the Reldorians to consider their options in the long shadow of human warships hanging silently above them like vultures. The human delegation moved through the station's dim corridors, their boots clicking against the metal floor in an even unhurried rhythm. Inside, though, the mood was electric. They had seen doubt crack through the Reldorian command like a hammer against thin ice. Now it was a matter of waiting to see how deep the fracture would run. Major Finley was the first to speak once they reached the privacy of the human command deck. "They're rattled," he said, entering a few commands into the security console to check for any hidden Reldorian devices, "but not broken yet. They won't back down easily," Lieutenant Zhang added, leaning against the reinforced wall. "Too much. Pride. Too many centuries of unchallenged power in their corner of the galaxy." Ellis studied the viewport where the human fleet hovered like silent giants, each ship ready for action. "Good," he said at last. "If they were the type to give up after one scare, they wouldn't have been worth our time." Behind them, the displays flickered with new tactical information. The Reldorian fleet had moved slightly, repositioning their destroyers and frigates into more defensive formations around the Conqueror. It wasn't a retreat, but it wasn't aggressive positioning either. It was the move of someone who realized they were suddenly standing in a lion's den. Zhang pulled up the updated diagrams. "They're running defensive drills, testing how fast they can respond if we attack." "Let them," Ellis said. "They need to understand what they're up against." Finley raised an eyebrow. "Think they'll fight?" Ellis shrugged. "Doesn't matter. We didn't come here hoping for a fight." He didn't add the next part aloud, but if it came, they'd finish it. Back on the Reldorian side of the station, General Nuzak gathered his war council in a private chamber carved into the station's lower section. The room was circular, walls lined with ancient weapons from their conquests, spears of fallen enemies, shields torn from defeated worlds. It was supposed to remind them of their invincibility. Tonight it felt like a tomb. Prax paced furiously, his claws clicking against the floor. "We cannot let this stand," he hissed. "If we yield now, we show weakness to the entire galaxy." Another officer, Admiral Morel, thumped a heavy fist against the table. "The humans. Their fleet is larger, yes, but perhaps not invincible. Their arrogance may be their downfall." Nuzak remained silent, staring at the projection of the human ships. He zoomed in on one, the Triumph's Echo, noting the layers of defensive systems stacked one atop another like a fortress within a fortress. There were no decorative banners, no victory murals painted on the hull, just cold, endless purpose. "They are not arrogant," Nuzak said finally, his voice quiet but cutting through the room like a knife. "They are prepared." The others fell silent. Nuzak leaned back slightly, hands folded under his heavy jaw. "We made a mistake assuming they would be like the Zalari, the Ven, the Solari Ascendancy. Those races built empires for the sake of glory, then crumbled when we challenged their pride." "And the humans?" Morel asked warily. Nuzak looked across the room. "They build fleets not to rule, not to parade. They build fleets to survive." The thought was a heavy one. Survival breeds ruthlessness, not vanity. It meant the humans would not posture, would not bluff. If they fought, it would be to completely eliminate a threat. Prax bared his teeth. If we cannot intimidate them, what then? Submit? Nuzak's lip curled slightly. We are Reldorian. We do not submit. There was a murmur of approval around the table. But we also do not commit suicide, Nuzak added sharply, silencing them. We will prepare differently. In the human command room, the discussion was no less intense. We have to assume they're not going to just back off, Finley said, spreading a new series of probability charts across the table. There's too much at stake for them. Their honor, their standing among the other empires. If they admit weakness now, others will come for them. Ellis nodded slowly. Which means they have two options. Fight us and hope for a lucky shot, or find a way to save. Face without losing everything, Zhang whistled low. Tall order. Not impossible, Ellis said, but if they choose badly, we end it quick. Finley frowned. And if they get desperate? They might do something stupid, Zhang said, anticipating the unspoken thought. Sabotage, surprise attack, hostage situation. Let them try, Ellis said with cold certainty that filled the room. We came prepared for worse. He walked to the main viewport, hands clasped loosely behind his back. Outside, the stars glinted coldly against the deep void, a reminder that space had no patience for the arrogant or the reckless. Survival belonged to those who understood when to fight and when to let the other guy swing first. Tomorrow they'd see which kind of species the Reldorians really were. The next cycle arrived with a strange, heavy quiet. No Reldorian ships advanced. No new communications came over the station's channels. The humans stood ready all the same. Ellis and his team gathered once more on the observation deck, watching the alien fleet through reinforced glass. At 0800 station time, a transmission request appeared on the console. It wasn't a standard diplomatic channel. It came directly from the Conqueror itself. Ellis glanced at Finley and Zhang, then accepted. General Nuzak's image appeared, looming on the screen. His posture was rigid, and his eyes burned with something that wasn't quite anger anymore. It was calculation. We have reconsidered, Nuzak said, every word dragged from him like metal pulled from stone. We wish to avoid unnecessary conflict. Ellis nodded slowly. We can work with that. But Nuzak continued, his voice hardening. We request one condition before terms are finalized. Ellis raised an eyebrow. Name it. Nuzak hesitated just a fraction of a second. We wish to see your shipyards. The request sent a ripple of surprise through the human officers. Ellis kept his face blank. You want a tour? We wish to understand, Nuzak said carefully, how a race so young built weapons that outclass ours by centuries, Finley muttered under his breath. They think we're hiding something, some ancient tech. Ellis understood the deeper meaning instantly. The Reldorians couldn't grasp the simple truth. They were used to civilizations hoarding relics of the past, building on the ruins of dead empires. They couldn't imagine a species creating such power from scratch. Ellis leaned forward slightly. We didn't find these ships in ruins, he said. We built them. Nuzak stared. Engineers, Ellis said, voice steady. Human engineers. Men who figured out how to weaponize physics itself, who took every bit of knowledge we ever had and asked, how can we make it better, stronger, deadlier? The Reldorian Council exchanged looks, some skeptical, some odd. You built these weapons without divine relics? Nuzak said, almost to himself. Nothing divine about it, Ellis replied. Just stubborn. Men in greasy overalls with bad tempers and better ideas. The line fell silent. After a long moment, Nuzak gave a slow, reluctant nod. We will send observers. If what you say is true, our respect will be yours. The call ended. Jang exhaled, breaking the tension. That's new. Respect instead of demands. Finley chuckled. Maybe they finally figured it out. The real threat isn't just our fleet. It's that we can build another one, bigger and faster. And if they anger us, Ellis said, we will. 3 standard months later, the Reldorian delegation arrived at Forge Prime, Earth's main orbital shipyard. The Forge stretched around Saturn's largest moon like a metal ring, a constant hive of activity where new warships took shape under the tireless hands of thousands of engineers. No grand palaces, no gleaming statues, just enormous scaffolds, streams of sparks, and the rumble of machines singing humanity's anthem of creation. The Reldorian observers moved through the forge with stiff, wary steps. Everywhere they looked, humans worked. Greasy uniforms, rough hands, faces marked with carbon and welding ash. Men with missing fingers from old accidents, men shouting measurements over the roar of plasma cutters, men arguing over tolerances as if the fate of the world depended on it, because it often did. And through it all, not a trace of ceremony or worship, just work, brutal, relentless, brilliant work. One Reldorian officer paused to watch as a human engineer manually recalibrated a newly installed reactor shield. No drones, no remote systems, just a man, a wrench, and a brain faster than any computer. He was sweating, cursing softly under his breath as he adjusted the flow regulators by feel alone, the calculations racing through his mind. When the shield lit up perfectly calibrated, the humans nearby gave a few approving nods, already moving on to the next task. No celebration, no awe, just another job done right. The Reldorian delegation exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected shrines to power. They found workshops. They had expected ancient relics. They found men who could turn raw ore into destruction with nothing more than blueprints and determination. Later that day, in a meeting room overlooking the dry docks, General Nuzak stood silently as he watched the foundation of a new dreadnought being laid down. The speed, the precision, the absence of ceremony, it all spoke volumes. You do not worship your ships, Nuzak said quietly to Ellis, who stood beside him. Ellis shook his head. No, we build them. Then we build better ones. Nuzak was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Your engineers are your greatest weapon. Always have been, Ellis said. Outside the viewport, another ship roared to life, lifting free of the scaffold with a rumble that shook the forge itself. No anthem played, no crowd cheered, just another engine of survival, crafted by men who believed no limit was beyond reaching, no problem beyond solving. General Nuzak bowed his head slightly, a rare gesture among his people. Not submission, not defeat, respect. You have changed how we see war, Nuzak said. No, Ellis corrected quietly. We showed you how humans survive. As the Reldorian ships prepared to leave the forge and the humans returned to their work without missing a beat, it became clear. No monument, no battleship, no ancient weapon could match the raw, living force that built the human fleet. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it wasn't destiny, it was the will to build and build better. It always had been.